Hello everyone and welcome to our last module. We are going to take a look at hip hop, specifically the style of breakdancing. And let's jump on in. So here are your guiding questions. By the time you reach that quiz and prior to completing your assignments for this module, you want to make sure that you can answer the following questions. 1, what is culture? 2, why is hip hop considered a culture by some? 3, what are the pillars of hip hop culture? 4, how has society impacted and influenced hip hop culture? 5, who are some important figures? 6, what are the components of breakdance, the breakdance battle, 7, what is the sacred circle and what's its function? 8, how has media changed hip hop? 9, how is the body used as politics, inscribing and marking space? And finally, other than breakdance, what are some styles that fall under the umbrella of hip hop? So hip hop is best known for its impact on the dance world, but it's more than that. It's more than that. It's a cultural movement that began in the 1970s, specifically in the Bronx area of New York. It's the direct result of impoverished communities being pushed out of their homes and their ingenuity during this time, them holding block parties and at community centers to raise money for these new spaces that they were going to have to move into, these new lives that they had to create. So during the 1960s and 70s, areas of the Bronx, more than tens of thousands of homes in the Bronx were identified as slums. And because they were identified as slums, they could be demolished. So this displaced hundreds of thousands of people. These people are of Jamaican descent, Puerto Rican descent, African American, that Caribbean space. If you were to travel to the Bronx right now, it is still a diverse community. The father of my children works for a school in the Bronx, and in his student population, English is usually the second or the third language of his students, and he works in elementary school. This population is diverse. Now, this identification of it being slums meant that these people needed to move out. Now, let's think about this. If you are set to move, then that means that you need to have the finances in order to move. So that means that you need to have first and last month's rent for the new space, and then whatever other financial obligations that you need to make that thing happen. So boxes, whatever, packaging, those things. So this means money. But we're already dealing with an impoverished community. We're already dealing with a low-income community. So this means that this low-income community now has to figure out how to have more income in order to move somewhere, right? This is stress. This is stress. This identification of the slums, identifying these homes as slums, is also making space for an L train to be built and constructed through that area. So what's an L train? L is short for elevated. If we're looking at trains for public transportation, there are subways which travel underground, for subways. There are trains that travel on ground like trams and light rails and trolleys. And then there are trains that travel above the road, which would be these elevated trains. So this law make space for the construction of this thing, which means that we have to clear the space. These people have to clear out. Hip hop was born when these people blended their cultures in an effort to reshape their identity and keep their spirits high. We saw this in our jazz unit as it related to the Great Depression and World War II, where people were looking for that escapism. How can they keep their spirits high? How can they continue to make money? But we also saw this in our ballet unit with the Romantic era, right? So during the Romantic era, people are upset with the aristocrats. And they're like, look, we're not going to sing and dance about y'all right now because y'all living y'all best life. Meanwhile, we're out here suffering. We want to make stuff that that gives us a place to escape, right? So the ballets are these choreographed, the Romantic era ballets are these choreographed events, plays, stories brought to life. But in the space of breakdancing and hip hop culture, we're seeing this thing just develop. We're seeing it develop spontaneously and through improvisation. Hip hop is another example of a vernacular dance style that transitioned into a performance technique. So hip hop as we know it today is a performance technique. You can go and take classes for it. You can see it on a proscenium stage. You can see it all throughout the world. Even in our videos, one of the competitions that is coming up is actually a competition that happens in Europe. But it holds its origins in vernacular dance, similar once again to that ballet space where we saw these vernacular dance become a codified technique. Now we have ballet as we know it today and all of its iterations, right? But I also would like to offer this idea to you. Outside of the vernacular space, we talked about dance as in religion. The book identified several categories or functions of dance, and one of them, religious dance, excuse me, and one of them was healing, medicine dances. And I offer you this idea as it relates to the sacred circle. These people are healing themselves. We'll get a little further into that as we continue. So these folk dances, these attributes of folk dance, remembering that folk, traditional, social dance, vernacular dance are all synonymous terminology that tends to be the preference of the person that's speaking or the time in which the document was written, right? But across the board, these dances are performed by people. They're learned through observation, right? They're not owned by any type of institution. They're done to socialize, right? Hence the term social dance. This is how you socialize. It's how you be with other people. These movements, for the most part, are outside of religious ritual. But here's the thing. The book that we read from was written here in the U.S. And in the U.S., there's secular dance and there are religious dance forms. But that is not true of all dance. There are some places in the world where dance is dance, and it can be done to socialize, and it can be done for religious practice. We saw this in the space of the movements of Oshun, right? Religious practice, but now it's used in performance techniques, and now it even finds its space in some of jazz. We see movements of the Yoruba practice, movements of Oshun, right? Last but not least, these dances can be done by anyone. So who are some artists that inspired hip hop as we know it now? I'm going to start at the bottom of this list. Dougie Fresh, Biz Markie, and Buffy Robinson. These are beatboxers. Beatboxers are people who make music with their bodies. Specifically, they're making music with their mouths. There's a song, Make the Music with Your Mouth, Biz. And I would like to liken this to our jazz unit once again. When we saw that Stono uprising, when we saw the drums being banned from society, people figured out other ways to have that drum, have that instrumentation. So their bodies became that music. That tapping, that juba, that hand boning became a way, body percussion became a way to replace the music that was there, right? We also see this music being made with your mouth in that Rite of Spring, right? Because we know that the orchestration from the Rite of Spring was actually based on the bodily sounds that were being used in the villages, right? Stravinsky was inspired by sounds of people rather than music in and of itself, rather than instrumental music, I should say, in and of itself. Pigmeat Markham is a figure that we see in both the minstrel space and in hip hop. So he was a artist of color, but from our jazz module, we remember that people of color during that time had to still wear blackface, which is that burnt corkscrew mixture applied to your face in order to perform on stage. The interesting thing about Markham's character is that, on stage, his character on stage, is that the character on stage was actually a lighter skin complexion than his natural complexion. So for many artists, they were darkening up. Many people of color were darkening up by applying this brown face, and people that are not people of color were darkening up by putting on this black face. Markham was actually lightening up because his natural skin tone is darker than that of the burnt corkscrew. His character is this character pygmy performance character is talked about in that documentary that was included for our jazz unit. He's also brought up here because in 1968, he performs a song, Here Comes the Judge. And by definition, by our current definition of rap, this song would be a rap song. But at the time that it was made in 1968, rap was not a term. We saw this in our jazz, right? The music was happening in New Orleans long before 1910 when we saw the term written down. It was already happening. We see this in our also in our ballet unit with the Nutcracker, right? By date, the Nutcracker falls outside of the Romantic era, but when we look at the characteristics of a Romantic era ballet, the Nutcracker fits into those characteristics. And last but not least is James Brown. So James Brown is, oh my gosh, gets all of the accolades as being the king of king as it relates to hip hop. He is I don't even know if I have the vocabulary to talk about how instrumental he was as a person, totality of him as a person. James Brown's music, let's just begin there. James Brown's music was funk. So in original iterations of hip hop and these original block parties and things like that, these rent parties, they're using funk music. They're using James Brown's music specifically. So one, they're using his music to create the music that people are dancing to. Secondly, we are coming out of, we're still seeing traces of othering. We're still seeing that are direct results of slavery, racism, segregation, and things like that. Change happens slowly, so there are still effects of that. James Brown as a person, as a body, is someone who looks different than a dominant culture. So him being successful during this time, during his lifetime in the 50s, was an anomaly. He was one of few black faces that were allowed to be on television, and he was usually in a crowd of people that were not people of color. So his success as a person of color during a very trying time is one thing. But then we look at his movement practices, his agileness, his vocalizations, his energy, his multitude of dynamics were things that the original hip-hop dancers were trying to embody when they were moving to his music. They were trying to be James Brown. He was their hero. This brings us into this Holy Trinity, as they're called sometimes. This Holy Trinity consists of Africa Bambaataa, who was the founder of the Zulu Nation, which is still a collective of artists and scholars. So we see this happening in the Bronx, New York, but we also see this happening at Judson Church in New York, right? Because we know from our modern dance unit that Merce Cunningham and John Cage and their students have that experimentation that's happening at Judson Church, which gives birth to postmodernism, right? So that's happening in one borough of New York, while this Zulu Nation is creating this space. This has a space of artists and scholars that is giving birth to hip hop as we know it. DJ Kool Herc is credited for coining the term the merry-go-round, which is that breakdance loop, that extension that we'll go a little further into, and sharing this Caribbean art form called toasting. And last but certainly not least on this list is Grandmaster Flash, who developed a form of scratching. So another technique used to create music, to use that was applied to the funk music to create something else. Please feel free to take a break. If not, I would like to move on. What is culture? We began the semester with this definition, and ideally over the semester you've looked at how many cultures exist in the world, and have also begun to realize that it's not about being right or wrong. It's just that there are many different cultures. That's just it. There are many different ones. Culture is the collective of customs, arts, morals, values, social institutions, intellectual property, and achievements of a particular nation of people. Sometimes that you might belong to a culture that you were born into. Maybe that's your family. Maybe that's your geographical location, the region in which you were born to. If you were born in Indiana, you're a Hoosier, right? But then there are other cultures that you select to be a part of. For example, if you decided to play football, then you are a part of football culture. Football has its own dress, right? The uniform that the football players play on, it has its own language, right? Can't tell you what a first down means because I don't watch football. I don't know. But it has its own following. It has its own grouping of people. It's a culture, right? We also talked about Greek life. If you're a fraternity or sorority, there are certain values, certain practices, certain ideas that are aligned with your sorority or fraternity, right? So we can, as a person, be a part of several different groups, a part of several different cultures. Hip hop is a culture because it contains those aspects of culture. It has its intellectual property, its knowledge. It has its visual manifestations, which is graffiti. It has its oral manifestations, its DJing, and its oral, like the history, the going about, which is rapping and emceeing. And then it has one of its physical manifestations, one of the original physical movement manifestation of hip hop culture, which is breakdance. So let's step into this knowledge. I am going to read these bullet points because that's the best way to do this. Knowledge of self refers to the Afro-diasporic mix of spiritual and political consciousness designed to empower members of oppressed groups, according to Travis Gossah. So I listed that piece of information with the name of the book there because we want to make sure that we are always giving people credit for the work that they do. Otherwise, it's appropriation, it's plagiarism, and it's things like that. So I want you to know that I am demonstrating the things that I would like you to also do. This quote merges with the vision that Bambaataa had of hip-hop as a force for social change. I'm going to say that again. Hip-hop was initially designed as a force for social change. Bambaataa states that America has systemized our minds to be into materialism. But instead of buying into this nation, we should think about how we can give back to our communities. So within African Bambaataa, we see this idea very, or I'm going to use an African idea. It's called Sankofa. It means to go back and fetch it. You have to know your history in order to use that history to inform where you are in the present and move forward. So African Bambaataa feels like you need that knowledge. You need to know yourself. You need to know your community in order to assess your community, in order to build your community, right? Because that's your job, to leave this space better than it was when you got there. And that was one of the founding ideas of Zulu Nation. That disc jockey, that medieval knight, that disc jockey, so we're looking at these components, these pillars of hip-hop culture, that DJ sets the tone for the event. That DJ originally was using that funk music and then applying these techniques of cutting, phrasing, and backspinning to create these fictitious beats. So they're setting the atmosphere, the tone of the event. They also were battling somebody. So there would be another DJ there where they're trying to figure out who can sway the crowd more, who can get the best result out of the crowd using these methods of cutting, phrasing, and backspinning. These DJs are using this technique to create extended drum breaks, these fictitious loops in the music. And I'm saying fictitious because they're doing it in the moment. They're sitting there with the record, with its lines, and are finding that drum break on it, and then they're looping it right there in the moment. So there's a certain level of improvisation that's happening, right? And the dancers are moving to that improvisation. The dancers are then dancing to that break that was created, that loop that was created. And because they are dancing to that break that was created, we get the term break dancing. The MC, the master of ceremony, rap has been referred to as rhythmic American poetry, and it finds its earlier iteration in a Caribbean form called toasting, which is a lyrical chanting over music. This finds its space in a practice from the Moors, where their prayers have a certain level of rhythm and nuance to it, but it also finds its earlier iteration prior to the Caribbean in that of the Mali Empire within the role of the griot, who is the oral historian. So the griot has sometimes been, their role has been just diminished to be the storyteller. But I offer you this, when you look at the word history, what does it say? His story, right? So history is nothing but a collection of stories. Sometimes those stories are written down, sometimes they are given through oral tradition, but they are still stories nonetheless. The griot has the community role of keeping the history for a group of people. In actual practice, I've seen this happen at a wedding ceremony where there's a bride and a groom. The bride was currently living in Senegal, and the groom was currently living he was born in the United States, but both families had a griot. Now, because the griots keep all of this information, when the griots spoke to one another, they were able to find out that these two families had once, 200 years ago, lived side by side in Sierra Leone and were positive with one another, had good relationships with one another during that time. So prior to the exchanging of the vows, the bride's griot goes through and tells the good, the bad, and the ugly of the family. Then the groom's family's griot goes and tells the good and bad and the ugly of the family. This puts everything on the table, so then the representatives of those two families, being the bride and the groom, can decide whether they want to unify these families. They have an idea of what could possibly happen. They have an idea of what has already happened. This griot has helped them to navigate this process, or is beginning the process of navigating this process. This MC at these events is doing the same thing. They're telling you things like, who was there last week? Oh, such and such is here. They turned up last week. Da-da-da-da-da. It's going to be nice. They're letting you know what happened, who's there. And later on tonight, we got X, Y, and Z. They're telling you what is going to happen in the future. So they're giving you this navigation through the process. In TAT number 19, you are going to write a 2-paragraph submission. That first paragraph is historical information about hip hop. The second paragraph is going to serve as a historical document of the video that you viewed. You're also going to talk about the fixed format of the breakdance battle. Now that I haven't given to you yet. It is in the reading that you have for this module. So you want to make sure that you do the reading. And in our next lecture, but you have that information. Let me back up. So your 2-paragraph submission always serves 2 functions. The first function is to be a historical artifact that can teach the reader about the thing. So you want to make sure that you're using detailed, objectively detailing information and documenting information. The other part that it serves is it shows me your engagement with the course material. You're using course content to answer these questions. The course content is the foundation for your responses. So the lecture and the readings are the foundation. Now, I agree with having other voices in the conversation. So I am encouraging you to add an additional voice. That's how you get to that 100, right? But you must provide citations for the actual documentation so we know where that other voice came from. As we move into our next lecture, you're going to get the idea of the fixed format from this reading. And as we move into the next lecture, I'm going to break down those components of that format, the components of that battle a little more, so that you begin to see that connection to that rumba that began in 1495 that we talked about in our jazz unit, that came from Cuba to New Orleans and then comes back into the U.S. in the 1940s with the ballroom dancing, but how it interplays and how it sets the foreground for that battle. We're going to see that. We're going to talk about that in our next lecture. Please make sure that prior to the due date, you send me an email if you have any questions about TAT number 19. Send me that email in a way that leaves you space to respond to my response, right? So that we are going back to the idea of pacing. Pace yourself. You know when the assignment is due. You want to look at it, review it, and get it done prior to that due date. If you have any questions, please email me via Canvas, not Canva, via Canvas, and have a wonderful day.